The governor of Maine, Governor Janet Mills, was the first one to speak, and she said that Maine was breathing a sigh of relief that Robert Card is no longer a threat to anyone. That is a direct quote from the governor. She said that it is now a time to heal. The investigation will continue. She expressed her deepest gratitude, and at the end of her remarks, she repeated, Robert Card is dead. We then heard from the police chief of Lewiston, who expressed his gratitude to the people of Lewiston and fellow law enforcement officers helping to come to the conclusion that we have tonight, that the suspected mass shooter in Lewiston, Maine, has been found dead. Let's go to NBC's Tom Winter, who joins us now by phone. Tom, you've been covering this story. What stood out to you in the presser, and were there questions that weren't answered?
Well, viewers of MSNBC, perhaps not too surprised that he may have been found near the Androscoggin River. We've pointed to this for the last couple of days as a potential focal point for searchers because it acts as a natural geographic barrier. His vehicle was found along the river, so perhaps he went along the river at some point. Obviously, a lot more information to know, and it sounds like, according to law enforcement officials, they want to know that too. And reading between the lines of what Maine's Director of Public Safety, Dave Soshek, said, the idea here, I think, now is to say, okay, we know where he was at a point in time, which is his vehicle located along this located near a boat ramp. We know where he was found, and what they'll do is they'll go back and they'll look at residences, businesses. You know, think about how many people these days have Ring cameras. Think about how many businesses have surveillance cameras. What can they see along the way? Maybe even hunting cameras that are out there. We've seen that help out in searches in the past. And so they'll try to develop a timeline to determine where he was and what happened. The end result, of course, to some degree, is it doesn't matter because he is deceased and because they believe he acted alone. But they'll want to do that to get a better understanding of what occurred. They'll put that together, and that'll be part of their records. Obviously, with him being deceased, there's not going to be a prosecution at this point. So it won't be something that'll be part of the court record, but they'll continue to process the scene and they'll continue to look into his weapons. My colleague Jonathan Deans tonight, I know Jonathan's been speaking with you in depth with all of his great reporting tonight, but finding out what weapons he actually had, what weapons he actually used. The ballistics are still being done on that. I think those are important things as far as forming the public debate about these types of shootings, number one. Number two, to determine whether or not the yellow flag law worked, should have worked, whether laws need to be looked at. That's always something valuable after one of these horrific disasters and mass shootings, and you hope that some good could possibly come out of it. So that's what law enforcement will do. Mm-hmm. They'll piece this together. I think he smartly said they're going to slow down the clock. There is no rush anymore. They will take their time, do this as they see fit. They'll do it during the daytime, and they'll just methodically piece this together over the next weeks and months. That's how long it'll take in an incident like this. And, you know, as far as for remaining questions for me, certainly the path he took, the specific guns that he used, the yellow flag law, I think those are things that are all very much in play. And they have vowed in Maine to look into that. They have been looking into it. And I think that's something that has been part of the active investigation. The ATF certainly on it, FBI on it. So I think that's what they want to do. The question, I think, is, you know, when do we get that? Do we get that through a final report? But they've vowed to be transparent, and so for now we'll take them at their word. And I think that's going to be an important part of this, Jonathan. Ultimately, you know, whether he walked 20 yards this way or 15 yards that way to go from here to where he's found, I think is not ultimately relevant, and I'm sure it's a very little comfort to those who lost their loved ones.
Tom, one more question for you. Tomorrow there is going to be another press conference at 10 a.m. Eastern. What would you want to know tomorrow?
Yeah, so I think what you're going to find, and I think you laid it out well, you know, we started getting a heads up from some of our people in the field. My colleague Andrew Blankstein got the first heads up on the law enforcement side and immediately pinged Jonathan and I, and that was before 9 p.m. tonight. So it was approximately an hour after they initially found the body. Of course, they would want to do a positive ID, call people out, and I have to tell you, the FBI does possess, and I would like to know tomorrow at the press conference whether they use rapid DNA. The FBI has the ability to use rapid DNA they would most assuredly have his DNA already on file. They could have gotten that from any family member. And I did note, by the way, that they said tonight that most of the family members have been cooperative. I think that's important. There have been some questions about that, so we'll note that for the record. But when you look at that, you think, okay, 7:45, maybe they find him, maybe they do rapid DNA, and they're at that point able to determine this is the guy that we think it is. Obviously, if he died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound, maybe initial identification could have been tricky. So it makes sense it would have taken that long. Everybody starts getting notified at that point around approximately 9 p.m. Maine State Police, who's been handling and doing a very good job of sending us updates via email. Their public information officer sent us a note saying that there would be this briefing that we listened to tonight. And then we went from there. As far as other things to talk about at that press briefing, I think at this point, any sort of sense of motive, I'm not sure if it's going to provide a lot of clarity for folks. The most recent mass shooters, thinking of the mass shooter in Uvalde, this person, Adam Lanza, who's the Newtown shooter, we just never really seemed to get to the true bottom of what triggered them to do these incredibly heinous acts. And it just doesn't make sense to the rest of us, because how could it? Most people would never contemplate doing the type of thing that this person did. But to the extent that we can learn anything about that and learn about mental health, I think that's an important thing in this country that everybody's realized is a component of this. I think the more that we learn about that. So I would ask tomorrow, I would ask questions about any further developments on motive. I would ask questions about anything further about the types of guns that he had, and certainly the timeline of how this was put together tonight that I've sketched out. But I think they would obviously have a lot more firm detail because they're the ones that did the investigation, Jonathan.
Right. NBC's Tom Winter, thank you.